Halo Vespania, kita akan membahas tentang lemak jenuh. Apakah lemak jenuh itu buruk? Akan dibawakan oleh Dr. Andreas Enfield, dan Dr. Andreas ini akan berdiskusi dengan 6 dokter yang berbeda, ya. 6 dokter, terutama tepatnya itu 6 dokter medis, ya, yang bergelar MD. Jadi 6 dokter ini ada dari yang dokter umum maupun sampai spesialis ginjal, spesialis yang lain, olahraga, sport, ya. Jadi silakan bisa Anda lihat ulasannya, mereka talk show secara singkat, ya, dari Dr. Andreas Enfield ini terhadap 6 dokter yang berbeda, dan bagaimana tanggapan 6 dokter ini terhadap lemak jenuh. Apakah lemak jenuh itu buruk? Apa jawaban dari mereka? Silakan simak. Jangan khawatir, kita telah sematkan teks bahasa Indonesia di dalamnya, ya. Silakan tonton videonya ini.
Is saturated fat bad?
Yes, saturated fat is extremely deadly, and that is why there is so much of it in breast milk, in human breast milk. You can tell it's bad for you because it's in breast milk, that's right.
So I take it you don't really believe that?
No, not at all.
So what would you say? Is it good, bad, neutral?
I think saturated fat is perfectly good. And I like to look at everything through an evolutionary lens, right? And I've done a lot of research into comparative gut anatomy and physiology of humans versus other animals. And if you look at what humans ate, it's pretty obvious that we've had saturated fat our entire existence. And this has to be optimum nutrition for us. So we did not become the dominant species on this planet because saturated fat was bad for us.
Is saturated fat dangerous?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think there's very clear evidence. There's now been 3 or 4 meta-analyses, structured reviews of all the literature, and I think even the US dietary guidelines, people are saying that these things are not so bad anymore. So I think it's very clear now that that was a horrible mistake where we demonized saturated fat, and the cost of that to humanity is immeasurable. But I think it's very clear that saturated fat is not dangerous. I mean, probably in excess is, but excess of anything is probably dangerous. But saturated fat in moderation is perfectly okay.
Saturated fat, is it really bad for you?
I think this has been one of the biggest myths, and this has been propagated for many years. We've been afraid of saturated fats, total fats, but in particular saturated fats for years. And I think that originally there was a lot of confusion between naturally saturated fats and trans fats. Trans fats are artificially saturated fats, often called partially hydrogenated oils. And the thing is, those artificial man-made saturated fats were actually very bad for you, those trans fats. And we've recognized that, and nobody will argue that. Trans fats are bad, but it kind of gave saturated fats a very bad name as well. And if you go back, more recent studies in the last, say, 5 years have really shown that the number of saturated fats you eat really has no correlation to heart disease. That is, people who eat a lot of saturated fat don't get more heart disease. And this was always the biggest worry. This was what people always said: oh, you're eating so much red meat, which has saturated fat. Well, you're gonna clog up your arteries and die. That's not what actually happens. And if you look back, there really has been no evidence that that is true at all. If you think about it, of course, it makes no sense. That is, there are lots of naturally saturated fats. Coconut oil, for example, and a lot of animal products are saturated fats. Do you really think that the foods that our ancestors ate really were going to kill us? Well, if that was the true, then none of us would be sitting here today, because people ate lots of saturated fats, right? If you think about lard, for example, what many people used was pig fat, which is lard, and lots of saturated fats. They did fine. There's very little obesity. They didn't have any heart disease, and they did fine. So these are natural foods, saturated fats in a lot of natural foods. And if it didn't kill us in the last 2,000 years, it's not likely that they're going to kill us just in the last 30 years, right? So it's been a big myth, and it's been one of the very bad things that we've told people, is that it's bad for you, that you have to avoid it. It's simply not true.
Is saturated fat dangerous?
I'm not going to answer that, because thinking that saturated fat is either good or bad is the problem. So when we started getting into trouble is when we started talking about our food like we were chemists. What we really need to pay attention to is where did our food come from? How healthy was the place that it came from? Was it a factory farm? Was it a nice little biodynamic farm? And then what was done to it? Those are the things that people talked about for thousands and thousands of years, and that's what kept us out of trouble. When we got into trouble is when we started paying attention to things like saturated fat. If we look at the saturated fat content of a food and try to judge whether we should buy it or not, you have to know a lot of other stuff. Like, you have to know, okay, well, is it margarine? Because that has a lot of saturated fat, but it's bad for you, right? So it depends really what it is.
So you shouldn't care about saturated fat. You shouldn't even bother looking at if there is saturated fat in the food or not.
Well, my answer is, when people ask me what's a good fat, what I say is nature doesn't make bad fats, factories do. So if we're getting our fat from a factory, it's not going to be good, no matter what it's got in there.
Is saturated fat dangerous?
I don't think so. The research that implicated saturated fat that then led to governments and organizations getting online telling everyone to avoid saturated fat, the research was really kind of weak or poor, but it was the research that we had at the time. So in today's light of how we do research, it's just wouldn't hold muster to say saturated fat is bad or unhealthy, and so and I think that generally is changing now. The several papers came out over the last few years that at least the research world is understanding that saturated fat is probably not harmful.
Is saturated fat dangerous?
Look, I think it's been sort of well documented now that there is no association between saturated fat intake and cardiovascular disease. Now, what does that mean for patients? If we're talking about patients with type 2 diabetes, with abdominal obesity, with insulin resistance, which is the majority of patients I see, actually I'm more worried about refined and processed carbohydrates. It's not that I'm saying eat as much saturated fat as you want. I'm just saying, look, for you, for where your body is at the moment, your problem is refined and processed carbohydrates. Let's not worry about the other things. That's the way I sort of manage this with my patients.
Saya Joe Pengapu, setujukah Anda bahwa investasi yang terbaik adalah investasi terhadap diri kita sendiri, karena kita yang menikmatinya, bukan orang lain. Kita tidak mungkin membayar orang melakukan push up, pull up, squat, tetapi kita yang mendapatkan ototnya. Jadi kita yang harus melakukan terhadap diri kita sendiri. Selain itu, kekuatan dan kesehatan mental kita ternyata dipengaruhi oleh kekuatan fisik. Jadi kita harus melatih fisik kita supaya kita bisa mengatasi segala masalah dan tantangan dalam hidup kita. Saya Joe Pengapu bersama BINARAGA.NET, kami mengajak Anda membangun generasi baru yang lebih cerdas, fit, dan tangguh.
Di BINARAGA.NET, kami selalu percaya bahwa setiap orang pasti bisa memiliki tubuh yang ideal dan sehat. Dengan subscribe, like, dan share video ini, Anda turut membantu membangun Indonesia sehat dan kuat. Salam jelas fitness, saya JP.